Hello and welcome to The Danesh Show. I'm Eva Danesh. Today we are joined by Michele Ruiz, 5-time Emmy Award broadcast journalist turned serial entrepreneur, best-selling author, and speaker. So Michele, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Oh, thank you, Eva. It's such a pleasure for me to be here with you today on your own show. How exciting.
Thank you so much. So you have tons of experience in broadcasting at 2 different stations. You've won so many Emmys for all of your work. Can you tell me a little bit about what got you into it and why you were there for so long?
Yeah, so actually I had the idea to become a news reporter and a news anchor right around your age. I was in high school and I was involved in speech and debate, and I participated in competitions, and I had a friend, actually a love interest, a boyfriend in high school, and I went to his family home and his mother was watching the news, and there was a news anchor on who was very famous at the time named Christine Lund, and I walked into his house, into his living room, and his mom looks up from watching the news and she looks at me and she says, "You'd be really good at that." And that's really what planted the seed in my head to think, oh, and you know what? Actually, it probably was the best sentence I ever received in my life, because up until then, I was thinking I wanted to be a doctor. But honestly and candidly, I am not suited to be a doctor. I wasn't then, and I certainly am not now. To give you an example, I would faint every time I would donate blood for the Red Cross. I was just the trouble for them because I faint all the time. But I felt some family pressure about going into medicine because I had uncles, and my mother's from Panama, and I had many uncles who were in the medical profession. And it wasn't until my boyfriend's mom said this to me that I thought, oh, I'd never even thought about that, but you're right. And it kind of changed my direction, and it really, truthfully, became a career that I love and loved and was very well suited for. So that's how it started. So then I went to college and I majored in communications with an emphasis in broadcast journalism. And my first job actually wasn't here in Los Angeles. It was in New York for a program called Channel 1 News, which at the time was a program geared very specifically to high school kids, and it was fed directly into high schools via satellite. So they took 4 of us recent journalism graduation students out of college and brought us all to New York, and we became this phenomenon of a news program specifically for high school kids. So that was, frankly, the first program of its kind, and I think to date it still is, although it's no longer in existence. I think it recently just stopped being produced, but that concept of creating a news program for high school kids that was fed directly into high schools never existed prior to Channel 1. So I ended up going to Channel 1, and what was so amazing about that experience was that we were learning how to be journalists from very experienced journalists. So the producers and the directors and the writers we were working with came from the network news programs like the Today Show and the Evening News. And here we were just kids. But we got to do these amazing stories, and I covered politics in Washington. I did international stories. I traveled the world. It was just a phenomenal experience. So I gained in those 2 years so much experience that I was able to come straight to Los Angeles, which is home for me, and start here in LA in the 2 stations that you mentioned earlier, which were KTLA and Channel 4.
Yes, and you spoke about how that Channel 1 News was the first of its kind.
Yes.
So you were part of the first morning shows, the morning local news at KTLA. You were the anchor there. Can you tell me a little bit about how that phenomenon was started and how it's so widely spread right now?
Yes. So the KTLA Morning News was also the first kind of news program of its kind. Truthfully, at KTLA, here's what happened. At the time the KTLA Morning News launched, you had your traditional morning news programs. They're called the national network shows. So the Today Show with NBC, or CBS This Morning, or Good Morning America. So those are all network news programs that are produced out of New York from the network. So they're not necessarily local focused. So KTLA had a loss in programming in the morning hours from 7 to 9. They didn't have anything to fill that, so they realized that if they just put together some people and created some news programming, which isn't all that expensive when you compare it to like entertainment shows or drama shows. Well, to create news is less expensive than those kinds of shows. So they literally put a team of people together to fill 2 hours of time because they had nothing else to put there at that time. So it became a huge phenomenon because at the time there was no local morning news. So in other words, if you were here in Beverly Hills or Los Angeles and you wanted to see what was happening in the morning in Los Angeles or in Southern California, there was no option because your only option was watching what was coming out of New York. So it was really filling a need. So here we are, those of us who started on this show, and it became this huge phenomenon. And the realization came about that there was an appetite in the morning for local news. And the turning point for the KTLA morning news was when there were the El Nino floods, which happened in February. I can't remember exactly what year it was. It probably would have been 92. And it was huge flooding. And all of a sudden, you can imagine people in Los Angeles were very focused on what was happening with the flooding. Houses were sliding. I mean, it was disastrous. So that's kind of what created exposure about, there's this KTLA morning news. And ever since then, our ratings were through the roof because people discovered us out of a local need. And then we outranked, our ratings were higher than the national news programs. And the KTLA morning news became the model for local morning news programs around the country. So now today, some 20-something years later, and I know that because we just had an anniversary show, there you can go into any market, any city, and turn on, and you can still see the network shows like the Today Show and Good Morning America, but you can also find local morning news programs. And it was KTLA that became the model for that. So for a second time, I was part of this new idea and revolutionary idea as it pertains to news.
And you then shifted to KNBC LA News and doing afternoon and nightly news there. So how was that a different experience from being the morning news?
Great question. So first of all, when you do the morning news, if you think about it, now the shows start at 6 a.m. I think sometimes they start at 5:30 now or 5 a.m. Not totally sure. So if you're on the air, that means you're actually in the studio at least an hour and a half to 2 hours before. If you're on the air as a reporter or a news anchor, that doesn't take into account the writers and the producers who are preparing everything. They actually start at midnight or at 11 o'clock at night. So you're basically getting up in the middle of the night. I would be in studio at 4:30 a.m. every morning in Hollywood. So if you do the math and you figure out, so I was getting up in the middle of the night, which meant I was going to sleep around 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. So it was a difficult schedule to kind of adapt to, and I did it for 8 years. But it was exciting. I loved what I did. And, we had so many wonderful guests and different things. Of course, I was an anchor and a reporter. And so I loved the experience. But it wasn't until I left for good and then went to KNBC, the NBC owned channel here in Los Angeles, and I started to do the afternoon and evening news, that I realized, oh my gosh, for 8 years I was like on this perpetual jet lag, because during the week, Sunday night through Thursday night, I'm trying to go to sleep around 7:30, 8 o'clock, and that, by the way, a whole other story about when you have young children going to sleep at that hour. It's very hard. But then on the weekends, like Fridays and Saturdays, where I wanted to go out with my husband and friends and families and things like that, I'd hit the wall like at about 8:45 or 9. I'd be chatty, and all of a sudden dead because I'd hit the wall. So it was hard kind of trying to have these, have a quasi-normal life on the weekends and then having to adjust to my schedule on the week. So when I went to KNBC, total different life experience, and I realized, oh my gosh, I feel so different. I feel so good because I'm not on this perpetual jet lag. So that was a big difference. And also the style. I talk about the schedule, but also what's different is KTLA Morning News, and as a whole, morning news tends to be a lot lighter, friendlier, it can be goofy in some instances. It's not so structured and it's not so formal. And when I went to NBC and KBEV here in Los Angeles in the afternoon and the evening, totally different. More formal, more structured, so different style. Doesn't change how you do journalism, but just kind of different style, so.
And you won numerous Emmys for your excellence in journalism. What went into winning those awards, and how did it feel to be recognized?
So I think at the core, when you win Emmys and awards for journalism, it's really about good storytelling. When you receive those kinds of accolades and recognition, it's about good storytelling that very often leads to meaningful impact. So I'll give you an example. One of the Emmys that I won was for a story that I did on a woman whose efforts changed laws. And briefly to kind of explain that, I'm sure we're all familiar where there are these horrible incidents where newborn babies are abandoned and are found dead, either side of freeways or different places. And this mother out in San Bernardino heard on the news one day about, regrettably, this baby that had been found dead in a duffel bag on the side of the freeway. So she called the coroner's office and said, what is going to happen with this baby's body? And they said, well, we don't know who the parents are. We have no information on this baby, so it's going to be cremated and put into this what's called a John Doe plot or baby Doe plot. That so bothered her that she arranged with the coroner's office to let her take the baby's remains, bury it in a cemetery near where she lived, and the cemetery called me to tell me about what she was doing. And her purpose was basically to say, I want to make sure that these infants who had no dignity in life at least had some dignity in their death. So fast forward, I ended up doing this story on her, and it got picked up by CNN and then all the networks and then People magazine, and so her initial mission evolved into her advocating to change laws. And now today, you may be aware of what's called the Safe Haven Law, where a newborn can be submitted and turned over to a fire station, a police station, or a hospital, no questions asked. So anyone can turn in a newborn without any penalty to the parents if they turn them over. And so obviously now babies are alive as a result of her work. So I won an Emmy for that story because, one, it was really good storytelling, but secondly, the impact of that story not only changed laws, but saved lives. So when you ask me about what is that like, I think as a journalist, for those of us who get into it, not so much for the fame and fortune, but to use the medium to make a meaningful impact, that is what has been most gratifying for me.
That's truly beautiful. Thank you for sharing that story.
Sure.
So switching gears a little bit, news from now versus news in 2005 when you left the news industry has completely shifted because everybody has a smartphone in their hands and is able to instantly share news with others. How do you see our world evolving, and how is that really impacting what people perceive as news today?
That's an excellent question, because you're right. The smartphone has changed so many industries, including the news industry, because now we have the ability with smartphones to be our own storytellers. We also have the ability to get information from other people that aren't professionally trained journalists. So what's changed very significantly is that from a news organization, let's just say the KBCs of the world or the ABCs of the world or KTLAs of the world, no longer just rely on stories and content that their internal journalists go out and capture. Now they're also taking in and accepting video and interviews that citizens are recording and submitting. And so sometimes you'll see that, courtesy of somebody's name or whatever the case is. So all of a sudden, citizens have become part of the storytelling or the journalism process. So that's one way. The other key piece of that is because of the proliferation of smartphones and social media and your ability to not depend on a network or depend on a media outlet to tell your story. You can just tell your story by creating a YouTube channel. We were talking about a YouTuber, or having a Twitter account. So you can broadcast, you can share your opinion, you can share your expertise. So now, of course, today we have people who are experts, whether they be in sports or medicine or politics or whatever the case is, food, cooking, whatever. And they have a vehicle to share their expertise. So what that means is, if I'm interested in national politics, I may or may not be watching what's coming out of NBC or CNBC or CNN or Fox News. I may actually follow certain people who are really good about distilling information about politics, and they're not necessarily journalists. They just have established a reputation for having a good perspective and a good handle on the topic. So it's become very competitive in the news field, where you don't have to just rely on traditional news outlets or journalists to tell stories. So consequently, because of the competition, it's changed the business in terms of revenue and those kinds of things.
And do you think your background of being a professional journalist really impacts your view on what you maybe share on Facebook, or what you see other people share on Facebook or other social media sites?
So yes, so now I'm an entrepreneur, right? I left journalism, I left broadcasting and became an entrepreneur, and I now have my third company, a technology company. So I'm very cognizant of brand and positioning and those kinds of things. So my journalism training taught me several things. The first is, I never put anything in writing or push it out without remembering what would happen if this got out and it was on NBC or the New York Times. I'm so cognizant of how innocent things that, you might be upset at something, you might just flame or put something angry, or you might, when you're not thinking straight, might put something out that under other circumstances you wouldn't put out. So first and foremost, I'm very cognizant of making sure that I don't put anything out there that I would be concerned about being in a bigger public forum. Having said that, I do have a large following, so it's an immediate concern as it is. The second thing is, I am very well focused on the importance of defending your statements. So if I say something, I make sure that it's defensible. If I'm not sure it's defensible, I qualify it. So I may say, I believe or I think based on this. I will hesitate to say anything with 100% true unless I can defend that statement. That person said this, or that person did this, or this person feels that way. Well, how do you know this person feels that way? Because this person said these words to me. So I always, and by the way, I use that in my companies, because when my teams, I talk to them and they come to me as a CEO, I need to know how I can rely on the information I'm getting. So they'll make a statement and I say, well, how do you know that? Oh, well, I think because, and I said, well, how do you know that? And well, I think okay, but I can't make a decision on what you think. You need to come to me with a defensible statement. And if it's just what you think, then don't present it as if it's fact, right? There's a difference between fact and opinion. So there's that. The other thing I think that's really important is the importance of storytelling. And this applies to anything that you are in. So the ability to tell good stories and influence and motivate and impact and create an emotional reaction from people serves me to this day as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, as a public speaker, because good storytelling can influence people to join you. Good storytelling can raise capital. My current company is investor-backed, so I tell a good story. Not that it's a false story, but my point is I know how to tell the story, and I know how to connect the dots. So I would say that good storytelling has also served me very, very well.
And you keep speaking about the companies that you have founded. Can you tell us a little bit about each one and why you started it and why you think it's so special?
So my first company actually was still while I was at KBEV. So when I was at KBEV acquired Telemundo, which is the Spanish-speaking network. And even though my career was always in general market, i.e. in English, my first language was Spanish. I didn't learn English until I went to school. I didn't learn English until I went to kindergarten. So from the time I started to speak until I was about 5 or 6 years old, I only spoke Spanish. So I'm bilingual and I understand Spanish and I can speak Spanish. So when I was at KBC and the acquisition occurred, I started to pay attention to what was going on in Spanish language media. And I realized there was a gap of content for Latinos in the how-to aspirational space. So think how-to college education or how-to citizenship or how-to personal finance. That was what we call both in culture and in language. So in culture means making it relevant for the culture, and in language means both in English and Spanish. So talking about good storytelling, I was introduced to two brothers who are what we call angel investors. They invest in entrepreneurs who have an idea. They haven't even created their company yet, they just have an idea. So I met with them over lunch. I had no business plan. I didn't even know how to create a business plan. I was still a journalist. And I said, I think there's an opportunity here and this is how it would play out. So they called me that afternoon and they said, this is fantastic. We will seed the first $1 million. So I basically raised $1 million to start a company based on good storytelling. So I call that, and I'm not going to use the words I really use because we're on camera and this is high school, but I call that a significant moment in my entrepreneur story. And I hung up the phone and I thought, oh my gosh, entrepreneurs live and die trying to raise capital. And here I just raised $1 million over a 2-hour lunch. So, so I ended up going for it. And I'll tell you the reason why. And that was the time that I left broadcasting. Because for me, broadcasting was never about the fame and fortune. I have certainly benefited, even still to this day, by having been on the air and having some notoriety and having the experience that I have. But for me, it was really about using the medium to make an impact and put crooks out of business and get them, in jail and change laws and all those kinds of things. So transitioning that into an opportunity to create a company that would help advance the outcomes of Latinos in this country was philosophically aligned with what I felt was important to me. So it was very easy for me to make the jump and become an entrepreneur for that reason. And the other reason was I also know that, and this still holds true today, for women, especially on television, less so on radio and certainly not so much in print, but when you're on television, there still is a bias that exists towards older women. So it's not uncommon where you see a lot, older men or heavy men or balding men. But if you really look at it, how many older women, heavier women do you see on the air? Very few. And so I knew that, wow, I have this opportunity on this one hand. I just raised $1 million and I raised it over a 2-hour lunch. How did I do that? And entrepreneurs try and raise money and it's always so hard. Or I could stay here, but in a couple more contracts, I'd be at that age where my contracts would end. And then what would I do? So I went for that and I became an entrepreneur.
And one of your companies is about eliminating unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that in maybe your broadcasting career or when you started out as an entrepreneur, there was some sort of bias against you because of maybe your race or because you're a woman?
Yes, so you're right. So my current company, my latest company, is a science-based technology company. So I'm a woman in tech or a woman in STEAM, and it is Bias Sync, and we help companies measure and mitigate the impact of unconscious bias in workplaces. So to your question, yes, I most certainly experienced the impact of bias as a journalist. More so, I think, for gender, less so for race. It's possible. I've never shown up in a room and been cognizant, I may be the only woman of color in a room, or I may be the only woman. It does happen. But my orientation was less about that, but more around the gender piece. So I think this is changing, and it's changing slowly, but it is changing. But when I was in broadcasting, it was very common for women anchors and reporters to get paid less than your male anchors and reporters. But we had these contracts where they also had these non-disclosure agreements. You couldn't talk about it. So there was a way built into the system where you couldn't talk about it. But we all knew that I was, at some point I would get paid up to 75% less than my male co-anchor simply because I was a woman, for no other reason, even though the importance of my contribution to the broadcast and to the news program was equally as important, or frankly, studies show that for women drive the ratings in a broadcast. So arguably, women are the most important persona on a newscast. So that existed. It was real. I believe that's changing now. I believe that there are laws that will continue to force that change. But yes, I did experience bias. At the time, it was what it was. There wasn't anything I could do about it. If I tried to make it an issue, then I would be blacklisted, and I couldn't then find a job after that because no other network was going to bring me on if they already saw me, quote unquote, causing trouble at one network. So you were kind of muzzled. So yes, I experienced it, but thankfully I'm proud to say that I think we're seeing movement, and that should change completely over the next, I would say, 4 or 5 years.
And you're also a best-selling author, kind of switching gears a little bit. What inspired you to write your book, and how has it become so successful?
So my book is actually a very niche book. There are others in the pipeline now. It was so you mentioned the 3 companies. So I had the media company for Hispanics, and then I started a communications agency, and then of course my newest company, my technology company. With my communications company, I decided to write a book about communications, and so it was a very specific, very niche focused book. And so it did become a bestseller in the communications and in that space. There's a whole process in terms of when you write books that are nonfiction. And I'm pleased to say that it did become a bestseller, and it has the bestseller stamp on it. The key thing about it is that as an entrepreneur and a CEO, when I come into a room and I talk about the fact that I'm a book author, or they figure it out and I have a best-selling book, it immediately gives me some gravitas or some additional what would be the word, thought leadership status, because there's this notion, if you've written a book, especially if it's become a bestseller, then you're a thought leader. So it certainly has helped, even though my newest company is a whole different focus. It's not communications focused, so it has helped.
And what went into crafting that book? Like, from your initial idea, how did you continue it and end up through the publication?
Okay, so there's a strategy about writing nonfiction books. Fiction is totally different. The nonfiction, basically, very, very high level, is there is a system to develop chapters and what each chapter is going to focus on. You then develop your questions because you know what you want to say. And you hand the questions over to someone else, it could be you, and you turn on a recorder and you ask that person to ask you the questions. And then you answer them. Now, by answering them, they're recorded and they get transcribed. And so the transcription becomes the first draft of your book. Now, of course, it needs copy editing, so you can take out the uhs and the ums and, the things that happen when you're just speaking. But that becomes the first draft, then you edit and things like that. And then, so it goes through several iterations. And then there's, people who help with book covers and design and all that, and publishing and that kind of stuff. So there's a whole mechanism out there that exists to get that. But that's the one secret about writing a nonfiction book.
It's very cool.
It is.
And to end out our show today, I would like to ask you, what piece of advice do you have for somebody who wants to go into broadcasting or being an author or just doing something that wasn't what their initial intention was?
So I would say first and foremost, and you hear this a lot, but I want to put some context around it, is that following your passion is hugely important. Because if you do something that you're not so passionate about, or you lose passion for, you're not so great at it. Or you may be great at it, but you aren't enthused, and frankly, you don't have happiness and joy in your life. Let's just be real, right? So when you're doing something that you're not excited about or exuberant about, it can be hard to find joy in that, and life is too short to not experience joy. The other thing is as an entrepreneur, if you're not passionate about what you're doing, entrepreneurship's very hard. It is not easy. To go from an idea in your head to build a company, to create sales and make sure that people and companies actually want to buy what you have and build revenue and employ people, that is really hard. And there are days that you're going to get out of bed and it's going to be so hard, but if you're passionate about it, it's not an issue to get out of bed. You're still with it, you're still with it, you're still with it. So I go back to this, often stated phrase, which is follow your passion, but there's a real reason for it because it keeps you in the game when things get tough.
That's a side we never see when people tell us to follow our passion.
Exactly.
So thank you, Michele, so much for joining me here today. We really appreciate it, and thank you for sharing so many of your stories.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching The Danesh Show. We will see you next time.